In Jesus, you are fully known and fully forgiven and fully loved. This is why Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes.
We are going to talk about creation. How can we know that the God of the Bible is the creator, the source of creation and life? And I see a lot of new faces, so let me just throw this out there. This is not our normal. Normally we're going through a book of the Bible, verse by verse or chapter by chapter on Wednesday nights, just so you're aware. And we're kind of in the middle. You've caught us in the middle of a topical series if you've just shown up this morning. We're going through an Apologetics series. Rob started with a really good introduction. And then we did, what was the second one? How we can know the Bible is reliable. And then last week on the resurrection, and this week on creation. So, and I may have, no, this is the fourth one, so I didn't miss one. So I would encourage you to go back and listen to those if you're not up to speed on where we're at. So tonight we're going to talk about creation, and one of your notes there start off with teleological, a big fancy word for really a fairly simple concept. It's a rational argument that claims that the existence of God is supported by the order and the complexity, and those are the two fill-ins there, order and complexity of the natural world. There was this guy named Paley, P-A-L-E-Y, not Pele the soccer player, but a Dr. Pele, spelled a bit differently. And he came up with this idea in, I should have paid more attention to the date. I don't remember. It was quite a long time ago, anyway. And essentially the idea, the first sentence there talks about it. He essentially had the idea that if you were walking through a field and you came across a watch and you picked it up, it'd be pretty easy to tell that somebody designed the watch because it's got a clear cover on the glass. It's the glass, right, that you can see through. It's got these hands that are moving that have a designed purpose. They're telling you what time it is. And if you took it apart and you looked inside, there's gears, so there's precision in in how it's built and put together. Unless, of course, you have a watch that loses time all the time, it may not be quite as precise. But the idea, right, is that it's designed to keep time and to keep it well. So just looking at it, it's obvious that there's some kind of designer behind this, that somebody designed the watch. This is the teleological argument. And it's a fairly simple, well, the fill-ins there are more complex than a watch. The universe is much more complex than a watch. Therefore, it must have a designer. And the cool thing about this argument is that it actually has tremendous intuitive appeal, which in layman's terms means it just makes common sense. It makes good sense to common sense people. So intuitive appeal and common sense are the two fill-ins on B there. Common sense people, which apparently isn't very common these days, or more people would have it, right? Common sense. But and C on your notes there, the argument is actually taken on increased scientific weight due to the theory of intelligent design. Intelligent design is the next fill in there. This idea has had a lot of pushback at various times. There was Expelled, a movie that Ben Stein did in the not 1900s, in the 2010s, I think. Very good movie if you've not seen it. Talks about how the idea of intelligent design has kind of been pushed out of academia, how people are shunned for bringing that into the colleges and or into high school classrooms, even just to present, not presenting God, but just some kind of an intelligent design in creation, which again is common sense. If you look at the complexity of creation, it's pretty obvious that some kind of intelligence is behind it. So in the last one on the notes D, the privileged planet, how our place in the cosmos is designed for discovery. This was a book written in 2004 and it turned into a movie in 2010. If you've not seen The Privileged Planet, you must rent it, or they don't rent videos anymore, hardly do they? The Privileged Planet, yeah. I'm sure you can. Say it again? Look it up online. Yeah, I'm sure it's on YouTube or Netflix or someplace. Probably find it for free. I don't know if he's not directly connected, but you might find it on Answers in Genesis or that type of a website. Really interesting movie, documentary. He goes through, talks about where the earth is located, the fact that if we spun any faster, the earth that is, if it was spinning any faster, we wouldn't be able to survive. If it was going any slower, we wouldn't be able to survive. The tilt on the axis, all of these things that had to happen all at the same time in order for life to exist on earth. And the chances of that being done randomly or by chance are astronomical. In fact, I can't even remember the number, but it's like 10 to the 353rd power or something like that. It's just outrageous. Anytime they get past like 10 to the 50th power, scientists say it's impossible. It's just not possible. And so for all of these factors to have come together for life to exist on Earth, this is why the idea, and some of you may be familiar with this is why lately, because of facts, things like that just make it statistically impossible for it to be random or by chance. It's why they've come up with things like multi-universes, like there being billions of universes, the possibility of, right? And we just happen to be the one that exists and has life. Well, you know how much evidence there is for that? Nada. Squat, yes. So The Privileged Planet. I would encourage you to watch that if you've not. Or read the book. It's on YouTube. Somebody looked it up. Thank you, Google. And smartphones. If you picked up a smartphone out in the desert, wouldn't you expect that somebody made the thing? I mean, it'd be pretty simple. Anyway, number 2 on your notes there, creation theories against biblical theism. So there's essentially two ways that the universe came into existence. We'll talk more about this as we go through and at various points, but either there's a creative power, an intelligent creative power, so intelligent design, okay? Not even talking about God yet, but just some kind of intelligent designer, or it's just happened randomly by chance. Those really are the only two options. Or it's always existed is a third option. And we'll talk about pantheism actually as the philosophy that would think that matter has always existed. But that ran into some problems in the early 1900s. We'll talk about that as well. So A on the notes there, evolution is the first fill-in. And then who do we think of when we think of evolution? Charles Darwin. Yeah. Who else? Oh, Durwood. Okay. Yeah, Charles Darwin primarily. But the idea is actually much older than Darwin. He was born in 1809 and wrote The Origin of Species in 1859. So at 50 years old, after traveling the world, and you're familiar, I'm sure, with the Galapagos Islands and the things that he observed there, it wasn't just there that he made observations. He actually went on the ship, the Beagle, and traveled for 5 years. So it was a long voyage. He observed a lot of things. Was a really intelligent guy. I mean, there's no doubt that he was smart. And he actually had gone to, he'd started out, his father was a doctor. And he sent Charles and his other brothers off to become doctors as well. And he didn't like it. They had no anesthesia in those days, so they do surgeries, and the patients are screaming, and there's the blood and the smell. And if you've ever been in an operating room, conscious in the operating room, if you were the patient, it's not good that you were conscious. But if just to go in for procedures, I went to OIT for a few years in medical imaging. And I went in and watched them do a spinal tap on a guy, and the smell, I don't like needles either. I pass out when I get a shot, so I'm sissy that way. But when went in there, between the smell and then the shot and then him groaning in pain, it's like I just about passed out. I'm standing over by the door. And it kind of started to dawn on me at that point that maybe this was not the best choice. Similarly for Darwin, he decided this wasn't for him. So he ends up going to Cambridge and enters into theology. So he actually had some theological teaching as well. But what he really found is that he wasn't all that interested in God either. He wasn't all that interested in studying, at least not those kinds of things. And he ended up his degree, if I remember correctly, is actually in geology. So he really enjoyed looking at geology, rocks, layers of rocks, and this was why he went on this 5-year tour. And then at the end of that ends up writing his book, The Origin of Species, which not the only thing that he wrote, but the thing that we're most familiar with for sure. 2 on your notes there, an important concept is uniformitarianism. And I should never leave a blank on a word that's so long and so hard to spell. But it's really pretty, it's uniformitarianism. So it's just like it sounds. Uniformitarianism. And there's a lot of definitions that go around this, but essentially, in regard to geology and dating things and paleontology, it's the idea that things haven't changed all that much over whatever the existence, however old the Earth is. That radiation has always been the same from the sun, that gravity has always been the same, that our environment essentially has always been very similar in a slow movement, slow changes over time, but nothing drastic. So the world that we exist in today is very much like it was primordial, is the idea of uniformitarianism. So think things like the Grand Canyon, okay? And this is still the case. If you go to the Grand Canyon or you go to any other big hole in the ground, right, that's got a river in the bottom of it, you look at the signs, the plaques that are around, and it says over millions of years, the erosion of this river has caused this canyon to form. Nobody believes that anymore, except the silly signs that are laying around. And you know, well, side note, none of them are taken very good care of either. Half of them you can't read half of what they say anymore either. But it's just, everybody knows that's not true. But the idea of uniformitarianism is exactly that. That slow erosion is how the Grand Canyon was formed. That slow erosion is how there's a mini Grand Canyon down by Four Corners. It's escaping Chinle, the valley that's there in Chinle. Those kinds of formations. The Great Salt Lake, the Great Flats, which obviously was a much larger lake at some point in time than it is now. But something happened in, well, I'll get there. The other thing that they talk about is like decay rates have been constant in this uniformitarianism idea. Mountains, valleys, the basic geology of the earth hasn't changed that much or that fast, that drastically. You get some sudden changes like with an earthquake, but in general, that's not the case. Things are uniform and layers are laid out like you would expect to find them. This is the idea. This is the concept they had, okay? And the Bible actually offers a different explanation. Violent upheaval associated with a great flood. And I didn't leave you any fill-in. You may not even have these notes in your notes, I don't recall. But catastrophic events is the idea here. And that's actually what most geologists believe how things were formed in this day and age. But you don't hear that, do you, in general? I mean, out in public, you certainly don't hear it in school. You still hear things like the uniformity idea. And what brought this to a head actually was an event that happened in, I think it was not just the 1980s, but 1980, the eruption of Mount St. Helens. And I've brought this up before on Wednesday nights. But there's a 100-foot cliff or canyon that was cut through solid rock that they know for a fact happened in a 24-hour period. And then the layers where things laid out, it looks just like the sedimentary layers that they find in the Grand Canyon and other places, and they try to date them. Well, what happens when you've got a sudden rush of water and you've got particles in it, and they're floating and they sort out, and the heavier stuff lies at the bottom and the lighter stuff ends up in the upper layers, right, as it sorts and lays out. That's exactly what you find in every sediment layer in the world. Now, the exception is you find some places where tectonic plates have shifted and maybe lower sections have ended up over the top of newer, what you would think of as older, lower-lying ones, have shifted and ended up over the top because of earthquakes, tectonic plate shift, okay? So there are places where you don't find this nice uniform layering because of these sudden events. This is, to me, it's a much better explanation of places like the Grand Canyon. In fact, if you bird's eye view of the Grand Canyon, the Great Salt Lakes and other areas, if you ever, as a kid, you ever take a mud puddle and knock the edge out, and then all the water rushes through and it creates a little miniature canyon, right? It's exactly what happened at Mount St. Helens. It's exactly how the Grand Canyon was formed. It's exactly how all of these large, or most of these large canyons that are, especially the ones that are cut through solid rock, it's how they happened. It was cataclysmic events, short periods of time. Other things that happened at Mount St. Helens, you've got Spirit Lake, you've got all this blown down timber that ends up in the lake, and it's formed basically just a blanket. There's nothing but timber laying in the lake, and it's rubbing against each other. It's knocking all the bark off. All that bark is settling down to the bottom of the lake, and it's turning into peat moss, which turns into coal, which is where you find diamonds also. And there's actually the early beginnings of coal are already starting to form in the bottom of Spirit Lake in what, 40, 60 years, however long it's been? 44, thank you. My math is not that good one. Yeah. So there's at least peat moss there now. And again, precursors to coal and then also diamonds. Diamonds are coal under high pressure, right? That's where diamonds get formed. Another little tidbit that I read about those, and I'm going to talk more about carbon dating here in a minute, but coal shouldn't have any carbon 17 left in it, which is the isotope that they use for carbon dating. But it actually, because it's millions and millions of years old, right? So the half-life of carbon 17 is around 5,000 years, if I recall correctly. So it shouldn't have any carbon dating left in it, or any carbon C17 left in it because of how old it is. Guess what they find in coal now that they have more precise measurements? They find this isotope that shouldn't be there. They also find it in diamonds, which are presumably older than coal, right? It's coal that's been put under high pressure, and there shouldn't be C17 in either one of those. And I'll talk a little bit more about carbon dating in a few minutes here. Another thing that to consider, because sometimes I have discussions with people about a global flood, the possibility of a global flood. People say there's not enough water on Earth for that to have occurred. And the mountain peaks are too high. How could you have enough water to cover, Mount McKinley and Shasta and Everest and all these really tall peaks, right? Well, again, this is the idea, that concept or that thought process comes from the idea of uniformity. The planet, at least on the surface, is 28% earth, ground, right? 78% water. 78% of the Earth's surface is covered by water. It's a water planet that we live on. And if you took, it's a weird concept, right? And it makes total practical, logical sense if you think about it. But if you took the Earth and just ended up creating a perfect sphere that didn't have peaks and valleys, you know how much water would be sitting on the surface? 12,000 and some odd feet with the volume of water that's on the Earth. So there's plenty of water to cover the entire Earth with 12,000 feet of water if things weren't exactly as they are now. Now, it's ridiculous to think that everything would be perfectly uniform, right? That it would be a sphere covered with water. So think of it this way, it may be easier. If you took and just cut all the land off right at the ocean and flopped it over into the ocean, all of the land would disappear. Does that maybe it makes a little more sense? The peaks and valleys that exist. So the idea of a worldwide flood is not that far-fetched if you have room in your thinking for great upheavals happening, especially around the time of the flood. Tectonic plate shifts, volcanic activity, a lot of things happening that we don't experience now. And the verbiage in and around the flood would tend toward it being a very violent time, not just because of rain, but being very violent. So B on your notes. Aesthetic or atheistic evolution, and in between that is Big Bang. So atheistic Big Bang evolution. And the idea of the Big Bang theory actually shot a big cannonball right through the middle of the uniformitarianism. and the idea of, the idea of evolution in a lot of ways too. It's used to support evolution as well, which is kind of odd, but the idea of this Big Bang evolution, or atheistic, so no God, Big Bang evolution, is that some 13.8 billion years ago when the universe began, it was this tiny, dense ball that exploded and became everything that we see around us. Why do they believe this? Well, a couple of things happened especially in the early 1900s. Einstein, his theory of relativity, something about his theory of relativity, he came to the conclusion that the universe either has to be expanding or contracting, that nothing just sits still. There's no stasis. Nothing just sits in constant equilibrium. It's got to either be expanding or contracting. And in more recent years, we have evidence, indications of an expanding universe because of increased technology, because of telescopes that, that they can see, and they're measuring things, and it appears from all of these observations that the universe is expanding. So because of the law of cause and effect, if the universe is expanding, if it's moving, it means it's moving away from a central point. It means, one, there was a cause for that movement, Big Bang, right? So an atheistic evolutionist would say, boom, in the middle of nothing, boom, this big explosion happened and everything is moving out, right? But it doesn't answer the question of what caused the big explosion in the first place. That's still a mystery. And this creates a problem. How did all this stuff explode from nothing, for one? Put another way, ask yourself this question, what makes more sense? That from nothing came a mind, your mind, thinking, conscious. From nothing came everything, including a mind, or that from a mind came everything. The second makes much more sense, does it not? Which feeds right into the teleological argument again. So, number 2, or the 2 I's there on the notes. Evidence against evolution. We'll look at a little bit. This isn't going to be comprehensive in looking at every single thing that brings denial against evolution, but a few things. And the pillars of evolution are, and this is the fill-in, time, fossils, and mutations. Time, fossils, and mutations. And time, in order for there to be enough time for the things to happen randomly and by chance, means that the earth must be billions of years old. Now, again, hear me, I'm not saying the earth is billions of years old, okay? But that's what an evolutionist must believe. Because time is a key factor. And here are a few problems with time. The first one under that is carbon dating is the next fill-in. And carbon dating is not reliable. It's used a lot, and it's potentially more accurate for short-term things, but they also tend to use it for really long periods of time, and it's certainly not accurate for anything past a few thousand years or tens of thousands potentially. 2 scientists tested some lava rock that was known to have been formed in the 1800s out of a fresh volcano, and they took this lava rock and sent it off to have it tested, and it came back, and the carbon dating said that it was 160 to 3 billion years old, and they knew that it had been formed recently. So the only conclusion I think that can be drawn from that is that it's not always accurate. Now, there could be a lot of reasons for the inaccuracy in that testing in particular, but there are other things that have been tested that would disprove the accuracy of carbon dating. It's not the only method that they use. They also use some testing methods that use potassium and argon and some other chemicals, and it's how much is left in particular products. But they have the same, and other radioisotopes that they also measure the half-life of, and they tend to use those methods for longer, like millions of years types of testing, okay? The problem with those is they also assume uniformitarianism. They assume that things haven't changed. That the environment's the same, that radiation from the sun is the same, that the half-life hasn't changed of any of these isotopes. They're also, with the argon and the potassium, there's no testing to know, or no way to know, if argon has seeped into the things that they're testing or if potassium is leached out, because that's what they're measuring, how much argon and potassium by ratio are in whatever it is that they're testing. So there's no way to know if they've been exposed or in an environment where things could have leached out or been added to. So again, the reliability is questionable in those things. The second, number 2 on your notes there, is the Earth's decaying and magnetic is the fill-in. The Earth's decaying magnetic field. And if you're unaware, the magnetic field primarily protects us from the sun's radiation. When we have sun flares, and they're worried about like EMP kind of effects of it knocking out electronics and everything, when we have big sun flares, it's the Earth's magnetic field that primarily that protects us from that, or from the effects of it, or reduces it at the very least. And they've been measuring since it was in the 1800s when they were first able to measure the Earth's magnetic field. And best estimates are that it's declining, it's reducing 5% every century. So every 100 years, it reduces by 5%. Now, I'm no expert in any of this information that I'm sharing with you, okay? But from the reading I did, the understanding that I took away from what I read about the magnetic field, it also controls the spin rate of the Earth. And if the magnetic field was stronger around the Earth would spin faster. So if you went back millions or even billions, 13.8 billion years, the magnetic field would have been, and they can calculate this all out, right? They know how strong the magnetic field would have been. And the rotation of the Earth would have caused so much heat that the planet would have burned up. It couldn't survive at the spin rate that would have been required for the magnetic field that would have been present that long ago. So I'm also using this idea of uniformitarianism in the sense here. Things could have changed, right? But at least using the kind of arguments that evolutionists would use, the Earth's magnetic field argues directly against that being a possibility. The third fill-in is moon dust. When if you're not an anti we went to the moon person, one of the things they were worried about when they sent men to the moon was that they were going to land and they had no idea how much dust they were going to encounter. And if the universe was billions of years old, they expected it to be feet deep, and really no idea because of meteorites hitting the moon and adding to, and or just space dust that is floating around all the time, and then it gets too close to a planet or to a moon, and gravity takes over and sucks it to the surface, right? So if the moon, which by all accounts is the same age as the Earth, if it was that old, the moon dust would be much thicker than it was. What they discovered when they landed and they walked was like there's a few inches of moon dust, which actually shocked them. They were expecting much more. So just that idea, the simple fact of the amount of dust that's on the moon also would tend to push away from at least millions or billions of years since of existence for the universe. The next one, number 4 there, is remnants from meteorites, and that's primarily talking about meteorites not necessarily hitting the Earth, but entering the Earth's atmosphere. They burn up, but you're aware of I think it's one of the laws of thermodynamics, that energy, matter, is never created nor destroyed, right? It may change forms, but it's never created or destroyed. So even when something hits our atmosphere and comes in, whatever it was made of ends up in our atmosphere and or on the surface, no matter what size it might be by the time it gets here. Well, they know what these meteorites are made of. There's a certain percent, I think it was a type of nickel, if I remember right. And they can measure that. They know, they've got an idea how much nickel should be on the Earth's surface because of time frame and the number of meteors that hit us every year or hit our atmosphere, it's nowhere near the amount it should be if we're billions of years old. All of the evidence from each of those things actually points to the Earth being thousands of years old, like tens of thousands of years old. Which, if you're a young earther, you're going, yes! And if you're not a young earther, that's okay. There's room. There are really smart people that are not young earthers, really good theologians that don't believe in evolution, that also don't believe in a young earth, and that's fine. They have good reasoning for that. I tend to disagree with them, but take heart, the Bible, and Genesis in particular, was not written to tell us how old the earth is. It was written to tell us how God created, and I think within that there are lots of clues about how old the earth is, but don't be dogmatic, whichever side of that argument you may come down on, because again, Genesis wasn't written to tell us how old the earth is. Okay, another B on your notes, little lowercase b there. And this all comes under atheistic Big Bang evolution. So actually my outline changes kind of oddly here. Not quite correct, but fossils in successively younger layers of rock must gradually change over time. So this is an argument against evolution, okay? You would expect if evolution, the idea of evolution is that we all came from a single organism, right? Single cell organism. And that all of life developed from one event, some kind of single cell organism that changed and morphed, and then over time, mutations, adaptations, became different species, became different plants, became different types of animals, and populated the earth with every living thing that we're aware of. Because the idea of evolution is that it started, very similar to the Bible, amazingly, that the earth was without life, and that some event sparked that event happening in this primordial goo, right? And there was an experiment a guy did where he actually sparked life in a little beaker thing, but the problem is he actually used elements that don't exist on Earth, or that that wouldn't have been the primordial goo that they would look back to the Earth being. And what he sparked was nothing close to what we would think of as life. But anyway, not enough information on that to share more. So the idea here is that from these layers of rock, we should see gradual change. Because again, Darwin's theory is that it's over time, slow changes, mutations that actually are beneficial, that create more advanced life forms as you're moving along. So if that's the case, you would expect to find transitional fossils in the rock layers, and they don't exist. You don't find them. There are no transitional fossil records. None. Zip. Zero. Contrary to what you've been taught in school. Contrary to the pictures that you've seen in textbooks. There aren't any. Not one. The best one that they have that they would call a transitional fossil is Archaeopteryx or something like that. It's a bird, okay? It's got feathers. And there's parts of it that appear to look maybe like a reptile, the tail section, and it's got teeth. It does have a beak, and it's got teeth. Now, and it's got claws on its wings, and it's got feathers, okay, that are still in the fossil. So it has the appearance. There's no scales. There's no skin. There's nothing to confirm that it's a reptile. But they make these assumptions because of some of the bone structure. And early on when they first found it, they were working from the idea that the bones were solid, like a reptile's bones would be. They've since discovered that actually the bones were hollow, like a bird has, and like you would expect a bird to have. The only oddity in this animal is the fact that it's got teeth, because we don't have any birds that still exist that have teeth. But if you look at bird skeletons and the structure of birds, they look exactly like this fossil that they try to claim is a transitional fossil. So that's the closest thing that they have to some kind of a transition, and it's been debunked. And here's just a quote from the guy who wrote the theory originally, okay? Answering the question, does the fossil record show gradual change? Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum layer full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain. And this perhaps is the most obvious and serious objection which can be urged against the theory. Charles Darwin, in The Origin of Species, says that. So he debunks his own theory because there's not the stratum that you would expect to find. So essentially, he didn't even believe it. I mean, really, or he believed it. He didn't find evidence to support it. So the lack of fossil records to support evolution has led to a newer theory that's come out. And this is the idea that evolution happened very rapidly in short bursts of time. Think X-Men. How many of you are X-Men fans? Anybody seen? Yeah, a few. I actually haven't seen them. But the idea that they even bring out in the movies, according to Rob, he was sharing this with me, is that that's what the X-Men, these genetic changes that give these guys superpowers, right? This is an evolution of man, and it's happening suddenly and rapidly, and this is why you don't see transitional fossils. Well, even in that scenario, right? They're still people. They're still humans. They're still Homo sapiens. So it doesn't explain how dogs became people or how apes became people. All these other thoughts running through my mind about things I read that were interesting, but don't have time to talk about them. So again, this idea, because of the lack of fossil record, they said they happened rapidly, and which fits in with the Cambrian explosion. In geology, what they do find is that they don't find these transitional fossils, but what they do find is fully developed examples of animals that you would recognize. So fully developed horses, fully developed Homo sapiens, fully developed crabs, whatever, the various fossils that you would find. The other interesting thing is that no matter what stratum you happen to find them in, they're identical. I mean, they're still recognizable, right? They're not changing. You find a T-Rex set of bones in this stratum, and so this time period, and then you happen to find them in another time frame, another time period, and they look just like the T-Rex that you found in the other stratum. So you're not seeing change even over what they would say are vast periods of time in these various layers. D on the notes, so there must be beneficial gene mutations for sources of variability for natural selection to act upon. Beneficial gene mutations? Yeah. In other words, again, the idea here of evolution is over long periods of time. Fossils is another pillar, right? There's three pillars here, and then the third pillar is mutations. And in order for mutations to be part of this, they have to be beneficial to the animal that has these mutations, right? These, changes. Genetic deficits, typically is what we would think of them, or genetic changes. So the majority of gene mutations found in nature are harmful, not beneficial. In mammals, to fill in, some helpful mutations have been observed in bacteria, but not a single one has been observed in animals or humans. In fact, when we have mutations, when we have genetic defects or mutations, what it ends up being is mental diseases or physical diseases, which would seem that we're moving from the perfect man to less perfect man, which would make perfect sense, fits right into the second law of thermodynamics. The second law of thermodynamics, that everything is in a constant state of decay, including us, including our gene pool, including our minds and our bodies. And that's not just on an individualistic basis as individual people. I mean, we know we're decaying, right? From about the time we hit 30, we start headed the other direction. The same thing for humanity in general. So, conclusion from this, or from the fossil record, and this is a quote from Lee Riker, who was an avowed atheist all the way through high school too, but through college, and was a scientist. Ended up at he had various degrees at various places, but he was at OSU here in Oregon, and studying various bugs, actually, was his thing, and how they communicated. Beetles that kill our trees, in particular, was one of his areas of expertise. And he made the quote there that's in E: "The Earth is probably very young. Fossils do not show gradual change, and mutations seem to always be harmful." He was a teacher at Pacific Bible College before he graduated, just about a year ago now. And but he was one of the professors at PBC, and had a rather interesting conversion story. I didn't hear it personally, but Pastor Rob was sharing it with me, and would have been fun to be in some of his classes and hear how this transition happened. But essentially, it was these kinds of evidences, and as he started to investigate evolution, he just saw all the holes that are in it. And you can read in The Case for Creation, which is a Lee Strobel book. He talks about how not only holes in the evolutionary story or theory, but also how some evidence is, frankly, it's just made up. It's fake. A lot of the drawings that you see and various things, and they're the product of someone's imagination, what their theory thinks this would look like. So another huge, and I think probably the biggest argument against evolution is the concept of irreducible complexity, and I didn't put this anywhere in your notes at all. But you consider a mousetrap. A mousetrap's really a pretty simple item, but you've got a wood base, right? And you've got a spring that's there, and you've got a big bar that's designed to whap and smash the mouse. And then you've got a catch that keeps the bar from, just doing its own thing, so it's controlled. And a little plate, right, that hooks into, or the place where you put the cheese, or the peanut butter, or the dog food, whatever you're using to catch the mouse. The idea of evolution is that each one of those components developed on its own for no apparent purpose, and then just kind of fell into place and became a mousetrap. Seriously, that's the idea behind evolution. And part of the reason, a mousetrap is a pretty simplistic tool, right? But even that, if you look at it, it's obviously got a design, it's got a purpose, and generally things with a purpose have a designer that has created them, right? So, irreducible complexity, the mousetrap had to all come together at once in order to fulfill its function. All those parts and pieces had to be put together and implemented at the same time. That's a simplified explanation of irreducible complexity. Our eyes, being able to see, is an amazing piece of irreducible complexity. All of the nerves and all of the parts of your eyeball would have had to come together at the same time, and every other creature, for that matter, in order for sight to exist. And then finally, and this probably, they would have completely overlooked this because they didn't have microscopes like we have today, but the cell. They thought that a single cell was a very simple thing. But if you've done any reading about a cell, it's like miniature factories inside of there doing amazing things, like a DNA strand, right? I'm just going to make up numbers because I don't remember how many, but I think it's 46 in the human genome. And inside of that is all of these protein strings, and that's like hundreds of parts and pieces that make this up that have to be in the exact right order, in exactly the right place, within the exact right part of the DNA string in order for them to carry out their function. Now, the chances of that all coming together randomly is astronomical, in fact, impossible by scientific standard. So this simple little single cell that they, in Darwin's day and age, would have looked at and thought was quite simple is actually more complicated than things that we're able to create today. The way that it's put together and the way that it functions. So there's irreducible complexity even down at that level. So take note of those things. I didn't leave space for you to write those in, but they are important things. Number 2 here on the notes, why is evolution called a fact in textbooks? Well, frankly, because the only alternative is special creation. And special creation is the idea that God created or some kind of intelligent designer created. So special creation is the fill in there. And Lee's take on a fact is that it's merely someone's opinion of the truth until it gets proven incorrect. And these facts or these opinions are centered around their worldview presuppositions. So worldview presuppositions is the fill in there. And the idea of evolution, it's an atheistic attempt to answer the philosophical questions for the origin of existence. What does that say about existence? Say it louder. It's here for a reason. Well, would evolution say that? Evolution would say that we're here by random chance, that you're just a grown-up germ. So what's your purpose in life? Yeah. Evolution would say there is no reason for existence. There's no reason for life. It happened randomly by chance. So there's no purpose. And then D, a theory is a temporary explanation based on limited knowledge. To believe in a theory is to make a faith statement. So evolutionists, whether they want to admit it or not, are actually and atheists for that matter, are making a faith statement. And Lee, another quote from Lee there, it's never scientific to call a theory fact. And evolution is a theory. It's an idea. With some evidence that points toward it, right? I mean, there's certainly evidence around natural selection or survival of the fittest, adaptation kinds of ideas. There's certainly evidence to support those things. And there's microevolution. Certainly there's evidence of microevolution, but there's absolutely zero evidence of macro, large-scale, species change type of evolution. So C, the next blank there is theistic evolution. So this is trying to blend a belief in God with the idea of evolution based on geology, essentially, or the age of the earth, and ideas that rebuffed people in, mostly in misinterpreting Genesis, a lot of it. Here's the idea behind special creation, a bad way to think of Genesis, okay? God created everything that exists at that time. It doesn't say that. It says that he created types of animals, and then those animals dispersed. So from whatever the original dog animal was, is where you get coyotes and foxes and wolves and beagles and all these variations, right? That those all come from one species, from one family. It's different because he says they go and produce and they make their own kind, right? They make their own type. Same thing with people. He didn't start off making black, brown, and white people. He started off making whatever color Adam and Eve were, and from them, the rest of us have all come. So you got to make sure you're thinking correctly about what Genesis says about creation. And then, so the idea of theistic evolution refers to the belief that God created the universe and initiated this process of evolution, allowing natural laws to guide the development of life and the cosmos over vast periods of time, essentially acting as a creator who set the stage for evolution to occur without direct intervention in every step of the process. This view attempts to reconcile scientific understanding of evolution with religious faith by seeing God as the ultimate source of creation, working through natural mechanisms. The problem with this view is that it's deistic in nature, and deistic is the fill in there. The idea of deism is that God wound it up, let it go, and hasn't been involved since. It claims that God was the source of the Big Bang, but then allowed the universe to work under unguided natural evolution. Side note, deism came out of the Enlightenment period, which was 1685 to 1815. What happened right in the middle of that? Right in the midst of that? Yeah, 1776, right? Yeah, right in the middle of the founding of our country. So deism played a huge role in the founding of the U.S. Many of the founding fathers were deists. They had a concept for God, but not Jesus as Lord and Savior, not Jesus as Messiah, not Jesus as the Creator, but more this idea of God winding things up, turning it loose. So they had no room for supernatural things, no room for Jesus in particular, no concept of Jesus being God. For many of them, not all of them, but many of them. Thomas Jefferson is famous for having a Bible that he took all the supernatural things out, and the reason was because the Enlightenment featured, and I think I put this in your notes, the definition of the Enlightenment. It was a range of social ideas centered on the value of knowledge learned by rationalism, empiricism, things we can touch, feel, taste, see, and then political ideals such as natural law. And here you'll hear our Constitution in these things. Natural law, liberty, progress, toleration, fraternity, constitutional government, and the formal separation of church and state. These are the concepts that came out of Enlightenment. And you can hear those in the founding documents of our nation. And the Enlightenment brought secular thought to Europe and reshaped the way that people understood the issues around liberty, equality, individual rights. And today we see those ideas serving as a cornerstone for the world's strongest democracies, like our country. And the only reason I bring that up is just to put a little bit of separation in this idea that we were once a Christian nation. We certainly were influenced by Christian ideas and ideals, and much of our law comes directly out of the Ten Commandments, and those things are all good, right? And we should strive to obey God and have those things incorporated into our culture and into our society as norms, as they really used to be, much more so than they are now. But we don't want to get this nationalistic idea that we're a Christian nation, because frankly we never have been, not since our founding. I thought I wasn't going to have enough things to talk about tonight, and I'm running out of time. So the Bible clearly states that God is purposeful in his work of creation, that he didn't use randomness, which is part of the evolutionary theory. God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds." This is Genesis 1:24. "Livestock and creeping things and beasts of the earth according to their kinds." And it was so. The main conflict with biblical creation and theistic evolution is in the randomness required, and that's your fill-in, randomness required for natural selection. The idea of this randomness would mean that, as Genesis says, the earth started out null and void, and it essentially was chaos, right? There's this chaos because nothing was in order. It was just disorderly and was just there. And then God brought order into that as he started implementing his creation. Well, the idea of evolution would say that after God brought that order in, chaos re-entered, and we had all of these random events happening through billions of years or millions of years. It just doesn't sound like the creative God that we worship. And for Roman numeral 4, there are many former atheists start with the idea of theistic evolution when they convert, but they don't usually stay there. C.S. Lewis, in his book, The Problem of Pain, it's clear that he believed in theistic evolution or not. But in his later writings, you could see where he came around to the idea of special creation, of a creative God putting things just as he wanted. The next fill in there is pantheism. Pantheism is essentially a Hindu, Buddhist concept. It's a philosophical and religious belief that reality, the universe, and nature are identical to divinity or a supreme entity, that everything, that the creation itself is actually God. And there are these iterations, there's almost this evolution within the creation itself, not just in mankind, but in all of the universe and apparently in God also in these ideas. Eastern religions like Buddhism and Hinduism as well believe this. Pantheism rejects the person of God and claims that the universe is divine and eternal, that it's always existed. And in rejecting the person of God, one has to reject any value of the individual. Again, this lack of purpose that evolution would have, pantheism would be very similar in that. Another competing idea is dualism, and this is the idea that both God and the material universe have eternally existed side by side, and thus there are two ultimate forces in the universe, God and matter. This view believes there's an eternal conflict between God and matter, or good and evil. A modern example of this, and I think I put all this in your notes, but a modern example of this would be Star Wars, which postulates the idea of the Force, right? And the dark side, and I guess it's just the Force if it's not the dark side, isn't it? So that's the idea of dualism. Notice how these things slip into our subconscious through movies, through music as well, television shows, whatever, things that we allow to influence, and without even realizing it, people can start to. I had a phone call the other day. Somebody experiencing some demonic activity in their life, and they were talking about, they felt like there was this contest between God or between Jesus and the devil over their soul. And it's like, this is the idea of dualism, that these are two equal beings. No, they're not two equal beings. The enemy may absolutely be doing something in this person's life to try to influence them and to try to steal them away. But it's no contest. I mean, if they are trusting in the Lord and under His care, there's nothing to fear in this influence that's coming, right? Anyway, it's this idea of dualism. The next fill-in is intelligent design. And this is the theory that life or the universe cannot have arisen by chance and was designed and created by some intelligent entity. And this actually is growing in popularity because scientists are more and more in agreement that our universe and life are produced by intelligent design, not unguided evolution, because they look around and it's obvious that that creation has a purpose. The cosmic fine-tuning that we see establishes that the cause or God of creation at minimum is 10 trillion times more intelligent, more knowledgeable, more creative, and more powerful than human beings. And that's a quote from Norman Geisler from Why I'm a Christian. And a second quote there from him: astronomers and physicists, even the few who still hesitate to call themselves theists, widely acknowledge that the only reasonable explanation for the intricately harmonious features of the universe, our solar system, our planet, all ingeniously focused on the requirements for life, is the action and ongoing involvement of a personal, intelligent designer. The Privileged Planet, the movie I mentioned earlier, explains that all the things that make it possible for life on Earth are also all the things that make it possible for us to observe the known universe. And the reason that that's important is because of the next section. And we're going to be short on time. I would plan to go to each of these verses, but let me just give you some more homework and encourage you to read Genesis 1:1, John 1:1, Psalm 19:1, Romans 1:19, John 3:16, the 1 John passage there. And I'm just going to walk through this last section to honor your time. So, summary, conclusion, some questions to ask. How did the universe come into being? Well, in order for anything to exist, it's necessary that something has always existed. This is part of the cosmological argument, and we'll talk about it more next week. It's one of the key concepts of philosophical arguments, particularly the cosmological argument, which is essentially that if everything has a cause, then there must be a necessary being that exists without cause. In other words, somebody or something has to exist outside of what we observe as the natural order of things to be the primary cause. And then the second question, why did God create the universe? Well, he actually created it in order for us to be able to observe his glory. That's the idea behind Psalm 19:1. It said the moon and the stars declare his glory. His creation declares his glory. Romans 1:19 essentially says very similar. It's we're without excuse because the creation reveals God to us, and we know it. We're without excuse. So God created the universe so we could see his glory. And then what's the relationship between God and the universe? There's three elements here. Materialism is the first fill-in, or three possibilities, three things that are put forth. Materialism is the next fill-in there. It's the most common philosophy among unbelievers today. It denies the existence of God and says that the universe is all there is, that the universe, matter, has always existed. The next one is deism. Some of this is review, right? We just went through all this. Deism is the view that God is not now directly involved in creation. They believe that God is transcendent, above all things, in charge of all things, but that he's not immanent, which means close to us, which is in direct conflict with what Jesus came to do. Jesus came to actually be close to us, to reveal his loving nature to us. And then third, biblical theism, the last option. God is distinct from creation, but creation is always dependent on God. And he's both transcendent, above all things, greater than all things, and yet immanent, close to us. So the fill-ins, in the next section here, 1, 2, and 3, God created the world out of nothing. He didn't need matter. He didn't need dirt. He didn't need things. He made it out of nothing. He spoke the world into existence, is what Genesis tells us. He spoke and it happened. So matter is actually an expression of God's mind, a physical expression of God's mind. And that's what we see in Genesis. I put 1:1, but it's actually the first chapter of Genesis. The other thing that you see there is the involvement of the Holy Spirit hovering over the waters. So you've got God the Father, the Holy Spirit involved here. And then in John 1:1, it says, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And further down in verse 14, I think it is, it says that by him all things that have been created were created, speaking of Jesus. So, Trinitarian idea here, right? That all three, one God, three persons, one essence, all involved in the creation. And it says that everything that was created, this is for the people who knock on your door. They come in pairs usually, knock on your door and try to declare that Jesus is a created being. The first part of John where it says, the first verses in John where it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, they reject that flat out. But if you go to that other one, the one about creation, it's a little harder for them to reject that. There's no question in the structure of the language there that it's saying anything other than Jesus is the creative power, the creative person, the one who through whom everything is created. So you can share that with Jehovah's Witnesses when they come and try to tell you a different gospel. So the second fill-in, God created the world so we could see his glory. This is the purpose. And you see that again in Psalm 19:1 and Romans 1:19 and many other passages throughout the text, but those two in particular. And then the third one there, God created the world so we could know his love. That's the final fill-in, know his love. And you see that so clearly in John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he sent his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him shall not perish, shall not die, but have eternal life. And then the 1 John passage, that's a bigger section. It's where the famous verse that God is love comes from, which is absolutely true. And because God is love, he calls us to love one another, to demonstrate his love to the world through our treatment of each other. And really, these three thoughts together answer life's four biggest questions. That's it for the notes. This part isn't in your notes, but you might jot these down. The four big questions that people ask is, who am I? Where did I come from? What's my purpose? And where am I going? And the idea of God creating, actually in that process and the things we've talked about, answers all four of those. Who am I? Well, you're the image of God. Male or female, you're the image of God. Created in his image to represent him within his creation. Where do I come from? Well, you come from the mind of God. As I said, we're the universe, everything in the universe is actually an expression of God's mind. It's his thought in action, in physical form. So where do I come from? We come from the mind of God. If he quit thinking about us, we'd cease to exist immediately. What's my purpose? To bring glory to your Maker and to experience his love. And where am I going? Well, frankly, that depends on your relationship with Jesus. We all have a destiny. Romans 10:19 says that if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you'll be saved. Pretty simple. Believe that, confess that, know it in your heart, put your full weight and faith down in the Lord Jesus Christ. You'll be in heaven with him, in paradise, in a place that is far better than this. So a little caveat here, just a thought to take away. If any of the things that we've talked about tonight challenge your thinking, or you're dealing with somebody who's really steeped in evolutionary thought, or just ideas, stories out of the Bible are hard for them to grasp, the idea that God could speak creation into existence, don't get hung up on those things. We're not going to argue anybody into God's kingdom, right? We're not going to argue anybody into heaven, not even ourselves. But you can present these apologetics, the reason we're going through this, you can present these kinds of ideas to make them think, to make people think, and to think through why they believe what they believe. And you may help tear down or reduce some of the walls that people put up, some of the obstacles that they have to believing in Jesus. Primarily always focus on Jesus the Christ and what he's done for us, right? The gospel message that we're sinners, he came to save us, died on my behalf, died on your behalf, because somebody's got to pay the price for our sin. And in the end, that destiny, it's either going to be you paying for it eternally, or it's going to be trusting Jesus, knowing that he's already paid for it and living with him eternally. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your word. Thank you that you've given us minds to think, Lord, to wrestle with ideas, to wrestle through the text, to wrestle through your word, and also to really to be forced to think through what our baseline is, what our foundation is. If our foundation is to trust your word, to trust the things that you've said, or it's to trust man and our own ideas, our own thoughts, Lord. So thank you for challenging us in that way. And thank you, Lord, that when we surrender to Jesus as our Lord and Savior, you actually do renew our minds. You give us a different way of thinking. And because your sheep hear your voice, you make it easier for us to understand the Bible. You make it easier for us to accept things that are difficult because we haven't seen them. We haven't experienced them. So it is sometimes wild to believe that you just spoke things into existence. But what an amazing God you are. Worthy of our worship, Lord, worthy of all the glory that you receive. Thank you for sticking our planet right in the middle of the Milky Way that's got a great view of all of the rest of creation. Put us right in the middle of a clear spot of a really dirty galaxy, actually, that has a lot of fog, but we're in a place that's clear, and we happen to be on a planet that doesn't have gaseous things that we can't see through like many of the other planets in our solar system. So all of these things point just towards purpose and creation and your intelligence, your glory, your goodness. So thank you for these things, Lord. I pray for my brothers and sisters here that you would help us just to continue to wrestle through these ideas and to have good biblical concept of the truths of you being the creative God who made everything, making us in your image, and that you love us, Lord. Help us to experience that fully. And we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.